All right. Well, we're going to come back to the topic of different forms of ethical relativism throughout the semester. But this is the last of the recordings that you need to see that address ethical relativism. So as always, we have our archery theme and the focus on trying to hit the bullseye. And as you'll see as the semester goes on, trying to hit the bullseye of good in terms of virtue ethics, of right in terms of utilitarianism, and of ought in terms of deontology. I know those are names that are just names to you now. Don't worry about that. All right. So I want to start by saying beware of isms. What on earth is he talking about? Well, when you add an ism to the end of a word, it becomes a totalizing system. You are a human being, you have to have ego. Some of you are psych students, and so you have dealt with, or you've had psych classes, you've dealt with Freud, the idea of his image of how the human being functions with the id, the ego, the superego. We don't really think there's anything wrong with ego. We don't like egomaniacs. But when you turn it into egoism, it then means that ego is what is most important in the business of ethics. Or empirical versus empiricism. To be empirical is to be scientific, it's to research, it's to take and to look at the evidence. When we turn it into empiricism, now it becomes a whole system, and the mantra of empiricism is that there is nothing in the mind that isn't first in the senses. Empiricism says that the only way you have knowledge is through your senses, period, which actually has some difficulties as far as what we know from the cognitive sciences. You can see how the one thing is being research-based and focused on facts. The other thing is saying only facts teach us anything. Legal versus legalism. So some of you are pre-law students. There's some pre-law students in this particular class. And you want to have a good legal mind. But if we say that somebody is a person of legalism, well, it means that they're just consumed with the law, and that's all that matters to them. The classic villain of this sort is when we deal with Les Miserables, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. We have Inspector Javert, or Javert as Americans would call him. So Inspector Javert is somebody who just, all he can see is the law. And so he doggedly pursues Jean Valjean, who is a decent and a good man because he has technically broken the law. And if you heard I was a professor who's a legalist or who's consumed with legalism, that wouldn't be a positive thing, would it? Science versus scientism. So there are many scientists who value their own discipline. That's normal that they would. And those in the other disciplines, the social sciences and disciplines like philosophy and ethics, we think that there's insights to be garnered from science. But when somebody is focused on what we would call scientism, they think that science is all. We don't even need the social sciences. We don't need the other disciplines. All we need is science. Scientism almost becomes like a religion for them. To be skeptical is necessary. You've got to have sales resistance. Otherwise, you'd constantly be giving in to all the people reaching out to you for money and all the marketing gimmicks going on all the time. Got to be skeptical to some degree. It's a healthy thing. Skepticism means you're skeptical of everything. You approach everything skeptically. You're skeptical about whether or not people really love and care about you, and you're skeptical about everybody's motives. So you can see when we put an ism on the end of a word, it becomes a totalizing thing. So the reality is in your world, there are many things that are relative to where you stand, to where you're looking at something from. You have different perspectives on life and even on what you're doing here in Hassan, on this course right now, based on your past experiences in your family, in the situation and circumstances in which you grew up. Things are relative. And then the idea of relativity and Einstein's theory of relativity. These are things that we think are real and that it's helpful for somebody to understand to the degree that we can. Einstein's got a little skinny book that he wrote on relativity to make it accessible to those who are not physicists. And I would just really encourage you to read it. It's very accessible and helps you to understand basic concepts of relativity. But relativism then takes and makes the concept of things being relative the totalizing principle. Everything is relative. And so when we speak in terms of relativism, we're speaking in terms of something that just is, it takes over. Here's a little poem about relativism. It all depends on where you are. It all depends on when you are. It all depends on how you feel. It all depends on what you feel. It all depends on how you're raised. It all depends on what is praised. What's right today is wrong tomorrow. Joy in France, in England sorrow. It all depends on point of view, Australia or Timbuktu. In Rome, do as the Romans do. If tastes just happen to agree, then you have morality. But where there are conflicting trends, it all depends. It all depends. I want to say relativism kind of eats our lunch in the world of ethics. Just doesn't work. And so we've dealt with cultural relativism. I'm going to make yet some more comments about cultural relativism. These are the last I'll make. When cultures hold differing scientific views, specifically the Earth is flat versus the Earth is spheroid. I know we like to say round, but it's more shaped like an egg than it is like a marble. Okay, but when we say the Earth is flat versus the Earth is spheroid, we don't hesitate to say that the culture that thinks that it's flat is wrong. We think there are real, verifiable facts that we can point to and say everybody should believe these things to the degree that they have the capacity to. So, if some culture holds, contrary to the values of almost all other cultures, the idea that enslaving a particular ethnic group, or killing all Jews like the Nazis did, or all Tutsis like the Hutus did in the Rwandan genocide, or all Armenians, as happened in the Armenian genocide at the beginning of the 20th century, if someone thinks this is morally good, isn't it just as logical for us to say that a culture like that holds false moral principles, like we would say that they held false scientific concepts? We have some countries in the Middle East, guys, this is real, I'm telling you something true, where women are beheaded in public because they have been accused by their husbands of unfaithfulness. You can go and watch these videos on YouTube. There are also some countries in the Middle East where women are beaten in public with hoses. And you think a hose? Yeah, they take a hose and they put a cap on one end of the hose. They fill the hose up with lead shot, like what you put in shotgun shells. And then they seal the other end, and they use it like a whip, and they beat women with it. And again, you can go watch these videos on YouTube. They're there. So do you really think we cannot comment on cultures that do that behead women publicly? And that, I mean, we're not talking about a court of law. We're talking about just a public beheading. Or that where that they're beaten with hoses filled with lead. We can't say that that's wrong or evil. Seriously? The idea of cultural relativism suggests that we should let each culture live as it sees fit and not critique other cultures. And even if that were the right view, which most people don't believe it to be, it's still got a big problem. Such a practice would be feasible if different cultures didn't have to, have commerce with each other, didn't have to be around each other. But guys, the world is changing. Globalization is now a fact in pretty much every nation. People from all over the world, from differing cultures with very different moral practices, are living on the same block, in the same apartment house, and on the same streets. For instance, honor killings and clitoridectomies, female genital mutilation, are now taking place on American soil. The last of those things, clitoridectomy, has actually taken place in the state of Maine, where we're studying. So, strong cultural relativism is simply unworkable. It really is. It has all kinds of obstacles. Nobody that I am familiar with in the world of ethics thinks that this is a workable concept, who's anybody who's respected as having real-world understandings. Now, there's other forms of relativism, and we're just going to deal with them quickly. So the first one is, these things will be, by the way, on your midterm. You need to know these things. So if you're taking notes, make notes here. Subjective relativism, this is the right name for it. Wolff calls it individual subjectivism. He kind of coins his own name. But its formal name is subjective relativism, is the idea that an action is right if you approve of it. The idea is I make up my own rules. Nobody's going to tell me what I have to do, what I should do, or what I should believe. I'm the one who decides what's right and wrong for me. That's the concept. And so if you should censure me, if you should say, Dr. Johnson, it's wrong that you would be lying, or it's wrong that you would be showing favoritism towards this particular student, or pick out the thing that would be very obviously inappropriate on my part, if I'm a subjective relativist, the way I come back to you is I say, who are you to tell me it's wrong? Mind your own business. I make up the rules for me. That's what subjective relativism is. And there are people certainly who behave like this way. both a criminal element like this and also some pretty famous individuals who behave this way, kind of like the rules don't apply to me. Then there's ethical emotivism. Ethical emotivism was very, very popular at the end of the last century and into the early 20th century. Its greatest proponent was a man by the name of A.J. Ayer. And A.J. Ayer, when it came time for him to kind of have his swan song when he was getting near to death, he said, nothing that I have written is true. He realizes how wrong it all was. So that's a sad commentary on this theory. It's oftentimes called the Bouyer theory of ethics. You'll see why. So stay with me here because I'm going to say something that sounds weird and unrelated to ethics. I don't like cilantro. I don't like cilantro for a reason. About 10% of the population is like me, and for us, when we taste cilantro, a member of the parsley family, oftentimes used in Mexican cooking especially, it tastes like soap to us. And so I don't like cilantro. And so ethical emotivism basically says you think of moral utterances are merely expressions of approval or disapproval, that when Professor Johnson says to you, I don't approve of female genital mutilation, or I don't approve of honor killings, it's like me saying, boo honor killings, boo FGM, boo cilantro. That's comparable. It's like, it's just an expression of my tastes, my preferences, but I'm not saying anything real. That's the Bouyer theory. And yay is in the opposite direction. If I say that compassion is good or human rights are important, I'm basically saying yay compassion, yay human rights. Like I might say yay chocolate. Okay, so going forward, just to list these things. Cultural relativism, here's a formal definition. An action is right if one's culture approves of it. Subjective relativism, an action is right if you or the moral agent approves of it. Emotivism, moral utterances are merely expressions of approval or disapproval. That's all that's going on. And then objectivism, which is what I'm obviously proposing, is some moral principles are valid for everyone. So ultimately, what's at issue in the debate over moral relativism? And it's this, the existence or the non-existence of real goodness and evil independent of our own opinions. What I'm proposing to you folks is that there is obviously a degree of difference between cultures. That's not even able to be argued. That micro-cultural relativism plus macro-moral realism or moral objectivism. That yes, we acknowledge there's differences between cultures and people and tastes and all those things, but overall there's some overarching real things that are right or wrong, good or bad, moral or immoral. Is a strong moral relativism defensible? Obviously, I would say no. At least some moral issues are not relative to persons or to cultures, but are universally right or universally wrong. Some of them on a short list would be murder, betrayal of your friends and family, cowardice in battle, oath breaking, if you took an oath and then break the oath, as long as you weren't forced to take an oath, and it wasn't immoral, racial hatred and cruelty, abuse of children, torturing the innocent. I mean, we could add to this list. So, unless you're making a psychological statement about how someone perceives their own actions, if you try to repudiate this idea, you're entering into a fairly indefensible position. Your terms are becoming quite unclear. What do right or wrong, good or bad, ought or ought not mean if we say they're terms that are relative to persons and cultures? Let me give you it's not a thought experiment, but an analogy. Imagine that instead of making moral prescriptions, I'm speaking of physical health. And I tell you, well, health is healthy for most people. But for me, or for my people, sickness or disease are healthy. What will you conclude about my thought process? You'll conclude I'm either insane or I'm a moron, right? And so basically when somebody's saying to you that something that is obviously not good for human beings is good, I think we have warrant to make a similar conclusion. All right, that finishes off this segment of the class, guys. And so you should be done now with all different forms of relativism as far as after this week, you'll have a quiz on it next week, and then we're done.